October 12, 1978, 10:30 a.m. Room 100, Chelsea Hotel, New York City. A chambermaid opens the door to find a 20-year-old woman lying in the bathroom, collapsed beneath the sink. She's wearing black underwear. There's blood everywhere, on the floor, on the walls, smeared across the mirror. A single stab wound to the abdomen. She's been dead for hours. In the bedroom, her boyfriend, Sid Vicious, bassist for the Sex Pistols, the most notorious punk rock band in the world, is unconscious on the bed. He's wearing a leather jacket. There's a hunting knife on the nightstand. When police wake him, he has no memory of what happened. Nancy Spungen is dead. Sid Vicious probably killed her. But he's so high on sedatives that he doesn't remember. He'll die of a heroin overdose 4 months later, before the trial. The truth of what happened in Room 100 will die with him. But Room 100 is just one story in a building full of death. 7 years earlier, in 1953, the poet Dylan Thomas left the Chelsea Hotel bar, walked to the White Horse Tavern, drank 18 straight whiskeys, returned to the hotel and collapsed. He died 4 days later at age 39. His last words, allegedly, "I've had 18 straight whiskeys. I think that's the record." The Chelsea Hotel isn't just a place where famous artists stayed. It's a place where they went to die. This is the story of the Chelsea Hotel, 222 West 23rd Street, Manhattan. A 12-story Victorian Gothic building that has housed more artistic genius and witnessed more tragic death than perhaps any other building in America. A place where the line between creation and destruction became so thin it disappeared entirely. It's not just a hotel, it's a factory of art and death. And for over 140 years, it has never stopped producing both. In 1883, New York City's artistic community had a problem. They had nowhere to live. The city was transforming rapidly. Industrialization was driving up rents. Working-class neighborhoods were being demolished to make room for commercial buildings. Artists, writers, painters, musicians, actors couldn't afford the fashionable addresses where wealthy patrons lived. But they also couldn't live in tenements without losing the social respectability needed to sell their work. Philip Hubert saw an opportunity. Hubert was a French-born architect who specialized in cooperative apartment buildings, an innovative housing model where residents owned shares in the building rather than renting from landlords. He'd already built several successful co-ops on the Upper West Side, but those were for wealthy families. Hubert wanted to create something different, a cooperative building specifically designed for artists. The site he chose was 222 West 23rd Street in the Chelsea neighborhood. In 1883, Chelsea was transitioning from residential to commercial. It wasn't fashionable, but it wasn't a slum. It was cheap, central, and had character, exactly what artists needed. Hubert designed a building unlike anything else in New York, 12 stories tall, making it one of the tallest buildings in the city at the time. Red brick exterior with ornate iron balconies running the entire length of each floor. Queen Anne and Victorian Gothic architectural elements mixed together. The building looked vaguely European, deliberately bohemian, intentionally different from the brownstones and commercial buildings around it. The interior was even more revolutionary. Instead of uniform apartments, Hubert designed spaces of wildly varying sizes, from small studios to enormous multi-room suites. Some apartments had 12-foot ceilings. Others had private staircases connecting 2 floors. The idea was flexibility. Artists could choose spaces based on their needs and budgets, not standardized layouts. The building was designed with communal facilities that anticipated modern artist colonies. Shared studios, a common dining room, roof gardens where residents could socialize. It was part apartment building, part artists' club, part utopian experiment. The cooperative opened in 1884 as the Chelsea Association Building. The original residents were mostly respectable, middle-class artists, writers, and professionals, families with children, people who attended church and paid their bills on time. The Chelsea was bohemian, but it was refined bohemian, an acceptable amount of eccentricity. But by 1905, the cooperative model was failing. The building needed expensive repairs. Many original residents had died or moved away. The Chelsea Association couldn't attract enough new buyers to maintain solvency. The building was sold and converted into a traditional hotel. This transition from cooperative to hotel changed everything. As a co-op, the Chelsea had been selective about residents. As a hotel, it became open to anyone who could pay the weekly rate. And the weekly rate was very, very cheap. By 1912, the Chelsea Hotel had developed a reputation as a place where struggling artists could live long-term. You could rent a room for $8 a week, about $250 in today's money. If you couldn't pay in cash, the management would accept artwork as payment. The walls of the lobby and hallways filled with paintings, sculptures, and photographs from tenants who traded art for rent. This created a unique economic model. The Chelsea wasn't trying to maximize profit. It was trying to stay solvent while providing affordable housing to people who probably couldn't afford to live anywhere else. The management operated on a principle of benevolent neglect. Pay something, don't destroy anything, and we'll leave you alone. This attracted a specific kind of person, artists who needed complete freedom, who couldn't tolerate structure or oversight, who valued privacy above comfort. And it attracted people who were running from something, or running toward death. The Chelsea Hotel's golden age began in the 1950s and lasted through the 1970s. During these 3 decades, an astonishing number of important artists lived there, often for years at a time. The hotel's management, run by the Bard family starting in 1939, cultivated this artistic identity deliberately. Stanley Bard, who became manager in the 1950s, had a specific philosophy. He wanted the Chelsea to be a refuge for serious artists. He would rent rooms at below-market rates to writers, painters, and musicians he believed had talent. He would delay collecting rent, sometimes for months, if tenants were broke. He accepted artwork as payment and displayed it throughout the hotel. But Bard's generosity had a darker side. He rarely evicted anyone, even when they were clearly self-destructing. He provided refuge, but he didn't provide intervention. If you wanted to drink yourself to death at the Chelsea, Bard wouldn't stop you. If you wanted to shoot heroin in your room, he'd look the other way as long as you paid eventually. The Chelsea became a place of radical freedom and zero accountability. Walking through the Chelsea's lobby in 1960 was like entering a museum curated by chaos. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with art, abstract paintings, surrealist photographs, sculptures made from found objects. Nothing matched, nothing was labeled. Some pieces were masterworks. Others were incomprehensible. The carpet was worn through in places. The furniture was an eclectic mix of Victorian antiques and mid-century modern pieces that didn't belong together. The elevator, a ornate iron cage that moved with terrifying slowness, was covered in graffiti, stickers, and small artworks taped to the walls. Riding up to your floor, you'd see layers of artistic history. A poem scrawled in marker from 1955, a punk rock sticker from 1977, a painting the size of a postcard from an unknown artist who might now be famous or might be dead. The rooms themselves varied wildly. Some were tiny, barely large enough for a bed and a desk. Others were sprawling suites with multiple bedrooms, sitting rooms, and kitchenettes. Some had been decorated by long-term residents with elaborate murals, bizarre furniture, and personal artifacts accumulated over years. Others were Spartan, White walls, bare floors, a mattress on the ground. But what made the Chelsea unique wasn't the physical space. It was the community. Residents would gather in the lobby bar in each other's rooms on the iron balconies that faced 23rd Street. They'd argue about art, politics, literature, music. They'd share work in progress. They'd collaborate on projects that would never be finished. They'd drink together, get high together, sleep together, fight with each other, and return to the same conversations the next day. The Chelsea wasn't just affordable housing. It was a scene, a place where being broke and ambitious was normal, where failure was expected, where the gap between genius and madness was so narrow that sometimes you couldn't tell which side someone was on. But this creative intensity had a cost. The same freedom that allowed artists to create without constraint also allowed them to self-destruct without intervention. The Chelsea had no rules about sobriety, no policies about mental health, no concern for whether residents were eating or sleeping or taking care of themselves. If you were brilliant and disciplined, the Chelsea gave you space to work. If you were brilliant and unstable, it gave you space to collapse. And many, many people collapsed. Dylan Thomas arrived at the Chelsea Hotel in October 1953 for his fourth American poetry tour. By 1953, Thomas was one of the most famous poets in the English-speaking world. His readings sold out. His BBC radio broadcasts had made him a celebrity in Britain. His poetry, dense, musical, emotionally overwhelming, had influenced an entire generation of writers. He was also an alcoholic whose drinking had progressed from heavy to suicidal. Thomas had been staying at the Chelsea intermittently since 1950. He liked it because it was cheap, centrally located, and no one bothered him. The management didn't care if he came back to his room drunk at 3 a.m. They didn't care if he couldn't pay his bill immediately. They treated him like any other resident, which meant they left him alone. But by October 1953, Thomas was in catastrophic physical condition. Years of drinking had destroyed his liver. He had gout, gastritis, and blackouts. His doctor in England had warned him that another heavy drinking session might kill him. Thomas ignored the warning and booked the American tour anyway. He arrived in New York on October 20th and checked into room 205 at the Chelsea. The room was small, shabby, with a view of an airshaft. Thomas didn't care. He spent most of his time in the hotel bar or at the White Horse Tavern on Hudson Street, a pub that had become the unofficial gathering place for New York's literary community. For 3 weeks, Thomas followed a pattern. Wake up late, drink through the afternoon, perform at readings in the evening, drink until closing time, return to the Chelsea barely conscious. His friends and colleagues were alarmed. Thomas looked terrible, gray skin, bloodshot eyes, shaking hands. He complained constantly of feeling ill, but he refused to stop drinking. When people suggested he see a doctor, he'd laugh and order another whiskey. On the morning of November 4th, Thomas woke in room 205 feeling worse than usual. He told his girlfriend, Liz Riedel, that he felt like he was dying. She wanted to call a doctor. He refused. Instead, he went to the White Horse Tavern. What happened at the White Horse has become legendary, though the details are disputed. According to some witnesses, Thomas bragged that he was about to set a drinking record. He ordered whiskey after whiskey, downing each one quickly. Various accounts claim he drank between 9 and 18 whiskeys in a row. The exact number has never been confirmed, but everyone agrees it was a shocking amount even by Thomas's standards. Thomas returned to the Chelsea around 2 a.m. on November 5th. He was barely coherent. Liz Riedel helped him to room 205. He collapsed on the bed. For the next several hours, Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness. He vomited repeatedly. He hallucinated. He told Riedel that he was seeing demons. She stayed with him, terrified but unsure what to do. The Chelsea staff, following their policy of non-interference, didn't intervene. At 11 a.m. on November 5th, Riedel finally called a doctor. The doctor arrived, examined Thomas, and immediately called an ambulance. Thomas was rushed to St. Vincent's Hospital in a coma. He never regained consciousness. He died on November 9, 1953 at 3:39 p.m. He was 39 years old. The official cause of death was pneumonia and brain swelling. But everyone knew the real cause. Dylan Thomas had drunk himself to death, and he'd done it methodically, almost deliberately. The Chelsea Hotel became part of the mythology immediately. The room where Thomas spent his final conscious hours. The bar where he drank before the fatal session. The hotel that had housed him, enabled him, and watched him destroy himself without intervening. Room 205 became a kind of shrine. Future residents would request it specifically because Dylan Thomas had died there, or near there, depending on how you define death. The room wasn't preserved, the Chelsea wasn't that kind of place, but everyone knew, the staff knew, the long-term residents knew, the building remembered. But Thomas's death raised a question that would haunt the Chelsea for decades. Was the hotel a refuge for artists, or was it a place where artists came to die? Before we get to the Sid and Nancy tragedy, I need to ask, if you're finding this deep dive into the Chelsea Hotel's dark history compelling, please subscribe. We research these stories thoroughly and bring them to you every week, and I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your country in the comments below. Is this New York story reaching you in London, Tokyo, Sydney? Let me know. Now let's talk about punk rock and murder. By the late 1970s, the Chelsea Hotel had become ground zero for New York's punk rock scene. The movement that started at CBGB, a dive bar on the Bowery, had produced bands like the Ramones, Television, Patti Smith, and Talking Heads. These bands rejected the bloated stadium rock of the early 70s in favor of stripped-down, aggressive, three-chord music that anyone could play. Punk was DIY, anti-establishment, and deliberately ugly. The Chelsea Hotel was perfect for this aesthetic. It was cheap, run down, and staffed by people who didn't care what you did as long as you eventually paid rent. Punk musicians who couldn't afford apartments in safer neighborhoods moved into the Chelsea. They practiced in their rooms. They threw parties that lasted for days. They created an entire subculture within the hotel. Patti Smith lived there with photographer Robert Mapplethorpe. She would later write about the Chelsea in her memoir, describing it as a place where the walls absorbed music and art and held it like a gallery holds light. D.D. Ramon lived there. So did members of the Dead Boys, Richard Hell, and dozens of other musicians whose names you'd only know if you were deep into punk history. But the most famous, or infamous, punk rock residents were Sid Vicious and Nancy Spungen. Sid Vicious was born John Simon Ritchie in London in 1957. He joined the Sex Pistols in 1977 as a bass player, despite barely knowing how to play bass. But the Sex Pistols weren't about musical skill. They were about attitude, chaos, and destroying rock and roll from the inside. Sid had the right attitude, violent, nihilistic, self-destructive. He became the visual embodiment of punk rock, leather jacket, spiked hair, safety pins through his cheek. Nancy Spungen was born in Philadelphia in 1958 into a middle-class Jewish family. She was mentally ill from childhood, possible schizophrenia, definite personality disorders. Her parents couldn't control her. She ran away to New York at 17 and became a groupie on the punk rock scene. She was desperate, manipulative, and addicted to attention. Other women in the scene hated her. Musicians tolerated her because she'd do anything, sexually, chemically, to be close to fame. Sid and Nancy met in London in 1977. It was an immediate, destructive connection. They were both damaged people who found in each other permission to be even more damaged. Nancy introduced Sid to heroin. Sid gave Nancy the proximity to fame she craved. Within months, they were inseparable and completely addicted to heroin and to each other. In August 1978, the Sex Pistols had broken up. Sid was attempting a solo career but was too unreliable to function. He and Nancy came to New York to record an album. They were both deep into heroin addiction. They needed somewhere to stay. The Chelsea Hotel was the obvious choice. They checked into room 100 on October 7, 1978. Room 100 was on the first floor, just off the lobby. It was a small room, one bedroom, a tiny bathroom, barely any natural light. The furniture was shabby even by Chelsea standards. But it was cheap, and the management didn't ask questions about the track marks on their arms or the constant stream of visitors buying and selling drugs. For 5 days, Sid and Nancy lived in room 100 in a haze of heroin, violence, and codependency. They fought constantly, screaming matches that echoed through the hotel. They'd throw things, hit each other, threaten to kill each other. Then they'd shoot up and pass out. Other residents complained. The Chelsea staff, following their usual policy, did nothing. As long as the room wasn't being destroyed and rent was being paid, Sid and Nancy could do whatever they wanted. On the night of October 11/12, something went catastrophically wrong. The exact sequence of events will never be fully known because Sid was too high to remember, and Nancy is dead. But we know this. At some point on October 11th, Sid and Nancy bought drugs, probably heroin, possibly mixed with sedatives. They shot up in room 100. Nancy took Sid's money, around $1,500 in cash, and went out to buy more drugs. She returned hours later. They fought about the money. Sid later told police that Nancy asked him to kill her, that she'd been threatening suicide for days, that she begged him to stab her. This claim has never been verified and is probably a lie or a false memory created by drugs. What is confirmed? At some point during the night, Nancy Spungen was stabbed once in the abdomen with a hunting knife that Sid had bought weeks earlier. The wound severed a major artery. She bled out in the bathroom under the sink. The chambermaid found her body at 10:30 a.m. on October 12th. Sid was arrested immediately. He was charged with second-degree murder. At the police station, he gave conflicting statements, first claiming he didn't remember anything, then claiming Nancy had asked him to do it, then claiming he didn't do it at all. Toxicology reports showed he had massive amounts of sedatives in his system. His lawyer argued that Sid was so intoxicated he couldn't form intent to kill, which would reduce the charge to manslaughter. But the case would never go to trial. Sid was released on bail in early February 1979. On February 1st, he attended a party at his new girlfriend's apartment. He was celebrating his release and his 22nd birthday. Someone at the party gave him heroin, extremely pure heroin, much stronger than what he'd been using. Sid shot up and went to bed. His tolerance had dropped during the weeks in jail. The dose killed him. He was found dead the next morning. The official cause was accidental overdose, but almost everyone who knew Sid believed it was suicide. That he couldn't live with what he'd done to Nancy. That prison had broken something inside him. That he'd chosen, consciously or unconsciously, to follow Nancy into death. Room 100 was cleaned, repainted, and put back into service. For years afterward, guests who stayed there reported strange occurrences. The smell of blood that wouldn't go away no matter how many times the room was cleaned. The sound of arguing in the middle of the night when the room was empty. The feeling of being watched in the bathroom, the exact spot where Nancy died. The hotel never officially acknowledged the haunting, but staff knew. They'd avoid cleaning room 100 if they could. Some maids refused to enter it alone. In the punk rock community, Room 100 became a pilgrimage site, a dark landmark of the movement's self-destructive peak. Bands would visit the Chelsea and ask to see where Sid killed Nancy. Fans would take photos outside the building. The tragedy became mythology. But what does it mean that punk rock's most famous couple died in the Chelsea Hotel? That the building that had housed Dylan Thomas, Thomas Wolfe, and Arthur Miller also became the site of a drug-fueled murder-suicide between two damaged kids who couldn't have been older than 21. It means the Chelsea had evolved, or devolved, from a refuge for serious artists into something darker, a place that didn't distinguish between creation and destruction, a place where talent and pathology were treated the same, a place that would house anyone and enable anything as long as the rent was eventually paid. The Chelsea Hotel didn't kill Sid and Nancy. But it didn't save them either, and that's the point. The hotel never saved anyone. The question haunts the Chelsea Hotel's history. Why did so many artists choose this building as their final residence? The answer is complicated, uncomfortable, and reveals something dark about the relationship between art and self-destruction. Between 1884 and 2011, when the Chelsea Hotel finally closed for renovations, at least 30 notable artists died there or died shortly after leaving. Some from old age, some from illness, but many from suicide, overdose, or alcohol-related disease. The list is staggering. Dylan Thomas in 1953, alcohol poisoning. Nancy Spungen in 1978, murdered. Sid Vicious in 1979, heroin overdose. Herbert Hunk, beat writer and career junkie, in 1996, natural causes after decades of drug abuse. Virgil Thompson, composer, in 1989, lived at the Chelsea for 50 years, died at 92. Beyond those who literally died there, countless others experienced mental breakdowns, addiction crises, or suicide attempts at the Chelsea. Filmmaker Shirley Clark lived there for 20 years while spiraling into cocaine addiction. Poet Gregory Corso would disappear into his room for weeks at a time, emerging gaunt and incoherent. William S. Burroughs stayed there periodically between bouts of heroin addiction. The Chelsea developed a reputation. If you were a self-destructive artist, this was where you belonged. If you were drinking too much, shooting too much heroin, losing your grip on reality, the Chelsea would take you in. Not to help, just to house your decline. Why? Part of the answer is practical. The Chelsea was cheap and didn't enforce rules. If you were an artist whose addiction or mental illness made it impossible to hold down a lease anywhere else, the Chelsea would rent to you. Stanley Bard's policy of accepting artwork as payment meant you didn't even need cash. You just needed talent, or the appearance of talent. But there's a darker explanation. The Chelsea attracted artists who romanticized suffering. The myth of the tortured artist, the idea that great art requires pain, that creativity and mental illness are inseparable. That self-destruction is the price of genius, was everywhere in the Chelsea's culture. Residents would sit in the lobby bar and talk about how their suffering made their work more authentic. They'd wear their addictions like badges of honor. They'd compete over who'd hit bottom hardest and survived. This wasn't healthy community. It was collective delusion masquerading as artistic integrity. The Chelsea Hotel enabled this delusion by treating all residents exactly the same. It didn't matter if you were a legitimate genius like Arthur Miller or a talentless addict who happened to write terrible poetry. You got the same room, the same treatment, the same blind eye to whatever you were doing behind your door. The hotel's radical egalitarianism meant it couldn't distinguish between people who needed support and people who needed intervention. I want to pause here because we're about to get into some really heavy territory about addiction, mental illness, and the mythology around doomed artists. If you're finding this analysis valuable, if you appreciate the research and the unflinching look at these dark stories, please hit subscribe. It really helps us continue making these deep dives. And seriously, where are you watching from? I'd love to know if this New York story is resonating internationally. Drop your country below. Now let's talk about what happened when the mythology became reality. The Chelsea Hotel's approach to mental health and addiction was, by modern standards, criminally negligent. There was no screening process for residents. If you could pay or promise to pay eventually, you could stay. This meant people in active psychosis, people detoxing from drugs, people contemplating suicide all lived in the same building with no medical oversight, no counseling services, no emergency protocols. Former residents describe finding neighbors unconscious from overdoses, hearing screaming from rooms where people were having mental breakdowns, stepping over passed-out bodies in the hallways. This was normalized. This was just what life at the Chelsea was like. The management's policy was clear. We're a hotel, not a hospital or a rehab center. We provide housing, not intervention. If residents want to destroy themselves, that's their choice. This libertarian approach sounds appealing in theory, respecting autonomy, refusing to parent adults. But in practice, it meant abandonment. Consider Vali Myers, an Australian artist who lived at the Chelsea in the 1950s and 60s. She was a brilliant painter and dancer, but she was also an addict who would disappear into her room for weeks, sometimes without food. Neighbors could hear her talking to herself. They could smell that she wasn't bathing. They could see she was deteriorating. No one intervened, not the management, not other residents. Everyone respected her privacy, which is a euphemism for everyone ignored her obvious crisis. Myers survived, eventually left the Chelsea, got clean and lived to old age. But she was lucky. Many others weren't. The hotel's tolerance for bizarre behavior created an environment where genuine mental illness was indistinguishable from artistic eccentricity. If someone was painting on their walls at 3 a.m. and screaming about visions, was that schizophrenia or just being avant-garde? The Chelsea couldn't tell and didn't try to. This ambiguity was dangerous. People who needed medical help didn't get it because their symptoms were interpreted as artistic expression. And people who were genuinely eccentric but functional got lumped in with the truly ill, reinforcing the myth that all artists are crazy. The Chelsea also became a haven for addicts because the hotel didn't enforce sobriety. You could shoot heroin in your room as long as you didn't deal from the building. You could drink until you passed out. You could take whatever pills you wanted. The management looked the other way. This created a paradox. The Chelsea was a refuge for artists who couldn't live anywhere else because of their addictions, but it was also a place where those addictions flourished unchecked. The hotel saved you from homelessness, while enabling the exact behaviors that would eventually kill you. By the 1980s, the Chelsea had developed a reputation beyond the artistic community. It was known among New York's drug culture as a safe place to get high. Dealers knew the Chelsea didn't call the police. Users knew they could overdose in their rooms, and probably someone would eventually find them. The hotel became a hybrid space, part artist colony, part shooting gallery, part hospice for people dying slowly from addiction and mental illness. And through all of this, the management maintained its position. We're just providing housing. What people do in their rooms is their business, but buildings aren't neutral. Spaces have culture, and culture has consequences. The Chelsea's culture, which celebrated radical freedom, romanticized suffering, and treated intervention as authoritarian, created an environment where vulnerable people were abandoned to their worst impulses. The hotel didn't force anyone to drink or use drugs, but it created conditions where drinking and using drugs seemed artistic, romantic, and consequence-free, until the consequences arrived. The Chelsea Hotel closed for renovations in 2011, after a protracted legal battle between long-term residents and new ownership. The new owners, a development company that had purchased the building for millions, wanted to convert the Chelsea into a luxury boutique hotel. They wanted to gut the interiors, modernize the infrastructure, and charge $500 per night instead of $50. The long-term residents fought back. Some had lived at the Chelsea for 30, 40, even 50 years. They argued that the hotel was culturally and historically significant, that it should be protected from gentrification, that forcing out the remaining artists would destroy what made the Chelsea special. The legal battle lasted years. Eventually, the developers won. The remaining residents were evicted, some negotiated buyouts, others were legally forced out. By 2011, the Chelsea Hotel was empty for the first time in 127 years. The renovations have taken over a decade. As of 2024, the hotel has partially reopened as a luxury property. The rooms have been completely rebuilt. The lobby has been restored to Victorian grandeur. The artwork that once covered every surface has been removed and either sold or stored. Room 100, where Nancy Spungen died, no longer exists as a separate unit. It's been combined with adjacent rooms to create a larger suite. The bathroom where she bled out under the sink has been demolished and rebuilt. Room 205, where Dylan Thomas spent his final conscious hours, has been preserved, sort of. The hotel acknowledges its historical significance and charges a premium for it, but it's been completely renovated. Nothing original remains except the room number. The new Chelsea Hotel is beautiful, expensive, and has nothing to do with the building's history except aesthetically. It looks like the old Chelsea. But it's a simulation, a cleaned-up, sanitized version designed for tourists who want to stay where Bob Dylan and Patti Smith once lived without actually experiencing the poverty, addiction, and chaos that defined their time there. This raises an uncomfortable question. Should the Chelsea have been preserved as it was? The romantic answer is yes. The hotel was a unique cultural institution, a refuge for artists, a place unlike anywhere else in America. Destroying it for luxury condos is gentrification at its most brutal. But the realistic answer is more complicated. The Chelsea Hotel of the 1960s and 70s was also a place where vulnerable people were exploited, where mental illness went untreated, where addiction flourished, where people died preventable deaths because no one intervened. Preserving that dynamic would mean continuing to house people in conditions that enabled their self-destruction. The Chelsea's radical freedom came with a cost, and the people who paid that cost were often the least equipped to afford it: the mentally ill, the addicted, the desperate. So what should have happened? Maybe the answer is that the Chelsea should have evolved, instead of being either preserved frozen in time or completely demolished and rebuilt. Maybe there was a middle path. Maintain affordable housing for artists while also providing support services, mental health resources, and intervention when residents were clearly in crisis. But that would require admitting that the Chelsea's mythology was partly a lie. That radical freedom without support isn't liberation, it's abandonment. That treating all residents exactly the same regardless of their needs isn't egalitarian, it's negligent. And admitting that would mean acknowledging that some of the deaths at the Chelsea, maybe not all but some, were preventable. That Dylan Thomas didn't have to drink himself to death. That Sid and Nancy didn't have to end in murder and suicide. That the Chelsea Hotel's policy of non-interference wasn't principled libertarianism, but moral cowardice dressed up as respect for autonomy. The Chelsea Hotel enabled genius. It also enabled death. And for over a century, it refused to distinguish between the two. There's a photograph of the Chelsea Hotel taken in 1978, just weeks after Nancy Spungen's murder. The building looks exactly as it always did, Red brick, iron balconies, 12 stories of Victorian Gothic architecture. Nothing about the exterior suggests that a young woman was just stabbed to death on the first floor. Nothing suggests that residents are shooting heroin in their rooms, that someone is having a psychotic break on the 7th floor, that the lobby bar is full of brilliant, doomed people destroying themselves in the name of art. The building looks beautiful, solid, permanent. That photograph captures the essential lie of the Chelsea Hotel. From the outside, it was a refuge, a place where artists could create without compromise, where freedom meant something, where the chaos of New York City produced genius instead of just suffering. From the inside, it was more complicated. It was all those things, but it was also a place where people went to die, sometimes quickly like Nancy Spungen, sometimes slowly like Dylan Thomas, sometimes metaphorically, as their talent and sanity eroded over years of drugs and isolation. The Chelsea didn't force anyone to self-destruct, but it created an environment where self-destruction seemed romantic, artistic, meaningful, where suffering was aestheticized instead of treated, where the myth of the tortured artist became a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the management, especially Stanley Bard, who ran the hotel for decades, enabled this by treating intervention as interference, by respecting people's privacy even when privacy meant letting them die, by collecting rent and artwork while residents collapsed around them. Was this evil? Not exactly. It was more like radical indifference dressed up as artistic integrity. The Chelsea Hotel believed, or claimed to believe, that artists needed complete freedom to create, that imposing rules, demanding sobriety, or insisting on mental health treatment would destroy the creative spirit, that the hotel's job was to provide space and stay out of the way. But freedom without support isn't freedom, it's just a different kind of prison. And the evidence is overwhelming. Many of the artists who lived at the Chelsea and survived, Patti Smith, Leonard Cohen, Robert Mapplethorpe, eventually left. They found other places to work, cleaner places to live, healthier communities to be part of. They didn't need the Chelsea's particular brand of freedom once they'd achieved stability. The artists who stayed were often the ones who couldn't leave, the addicts, the mentally ill, the people who'd burned every other bridge. For them, the Chelsea wasn't a refuge by choice. It was the last option before the street. So, what is the legacy of the Chelsea Hotel? It produced extraordinary art. Patti Smith's memoir about living there with Robert Mapplethorpe is a masterpiece. Leonard Cohen's song about the hotel is beautiful. Countless paintings, photographs, and poems were created within its walls, but it also produced extraordinary suffering. And it's worth asking whether the art justified the suffering, or if we've just convinced ourselves it did because the mythology is too compelling to abandon. The Chelsea Hotel is reopening as a luxury property. Rooms cost $600 per night. The artwork is gone. The long-term residents are gone. The chaos, the freedom, the danger, the creativity, all gone. What remains is a building. A beautiful, historic building with stories embedded in its walls. And maybe that's appropriate, because buildings outlast the people who live in them. The Chelsea has survived Dylan Thomas, Sid Vicious, Nancy Spungen, and everyone else who died there. It survived its own mythology, but the mythology matters more than the building. The Chelsea Hotel proved that you can create a space of radical artistic freedom. You can provide refuge to brilliant, difficult, doomed people. You can build something unique and important. But you can't do those things without consequence. The Chelsea's freedom came with a body count. And pretending otherwise, treating the deaths as tragic but inevitable, romanticizing suffering as the price of genius, is how we repeat the same mistakes. The Chelsea Hotel was a factory of art and death. Both things are true simultaneously, and neither justifies the other. The building has been renovated. But the questions remain. What do we owe vulnerable people? Is freedom enough, or do we also owe intervention, support, care? Can we create spaces for artistic expression without enabling self-destruction? The Chelsea Hotel never answered those questions. It just kept its doors open, collected rent, and watched people destroy themselves. For 127 years, and then it closed. The building will reopen. But the Chelsea Hotel, the real Chelsea, the myth and reality combined, is gone. What remains is memory, and the question of whether we learned anything from it. Thank you for spending the last 45 minutes with me exploring the dark, complicated history of the Chelsea Hotel. If this deep dive into art, addiction, and the mythology of doomed genius resonated with you, please subscribe. We bring you these thoroughly researched, unflinching stories every week. And one last time, where in the world are you watching from? I love knowing that these New York stories reach people in Tokyo, London, Sao Paulo, everywhere. Drop your country in the comments. What dark history should we investigate next? Let me know. Until next time, remember, not every beautiful building tells a beautiful story. Sometimes the most legendary places are built on suffering we've chosen to romanticize. That doesn't make the art less important, but it doesn't make the suffering less real either.